It's never easy to follow, Martin. Thank you so much, Martin. It's great for me to be back in Oxford and to have such an extraordinarily full audience in such a wonderful building here in Trinity, which I've not visited before, but I hope that I'll be invited back at some stage. So tonight is really an opportunity for us to look at many things and to consider the value of art by looking at some of the great paintings that have been sold over the last 40 rather than the last 30 years. Often revealing hidden truths, both about the objects, as Martin said with the Leonardo, but also about their owners, past and present. I'd like to cover key issues around the globalization of the art market, and Susie, who's doing her MA up at the top there, is very keen to learn more about the financing that goes on in the art market, who buys what and why and for what prices. And perhaps we can also, as we're looking at some of the images that come up on the screen, because art is about our eyes. Look carefully, enjoy. But then perhaps think about some interesting questions that you'd like to fire at me, or perhaps to other members of our audience here who know the art world perhaps as well as I do. So just a quick word about my career before we start the slides. I left Oxford with a half-decent English degree from Lady Margaret Hall, thanks to Dr. Shrimpton, who's up at the top of the audience this evening. A very smart and beautiful fiancée, who's now my wife in the second row, and the dream of working in the international art market. And I left Lady Margaret Hall in Oxford in the Orwellian year of 1984. So you can figure out how many years I've been in the art world. There aren't many things that I don't know about quite intimately that have gone on either at Christie's or elsewhere. But when I left Oxford, it was the year of the miners' strike in England. It was the year of the attempted assassination of Margaret Thatcher in Brighton. The global release of the first personal computer, the Apple Mac, which to some of the younger members of the audience must seem very peculiar, but that became the instrument for the development of the global art market, which I'll talk about later, really. The internet and the net that we could then cast over buyers across the globe was quite fascinating to work on, to build, and to sort of reap the rewards from. And it was the year that the Space Shuttle Discovery took off on its maiden voyage, and you can imagine that my world, leaving Oxford, was one of discovery. A deep immersion was what I started with. I went to Christie's in 1986 when Alice and I got married, and we went on this incredible journey. The extended internship finished about a year and a half ago when I'd done my training. And I decided that I would become an art advisor. And Chester, who's here on my left, who spent his time at Magdalen, decided to come and join me in the new art business. He wanted to join a startup. So he joined my startup. This marked an incredible moment in the art market where we moved from old master pictures holding the records for paintings that had been up on the public market to suddenly there being a shift towards modernism. This picture sold for 3 times the existing world record for any painting at the time that it came up, which actually equates quite closely to the success of the Leonardo, Martin, when it came up, which made 3 times the previous record. And I was asked when I sold the Leonardo how it was possible, and I used this picture from 1987 as the example. I said before this, the Mantegna adoration of the Magi had sold for 8.2, and lo and behold, Van Gogh comes along, knocks Mantegna off his pedestal, and this picture sells for £25 million. Interestingly, Monet had sold for just short of the Mantegna price just before this, so the indications were that a shift in taste was already starting in the late 80s. But actually what happened after this was that every single record, until the Salvator Mundi came along, was for a 20th century painting. And we'll look at some of those, or late 19th century, early 20th century. We'll look at some of those tonight as we walk through some of these great moments. Why did this picture make 25 million? is a fascinating question. The first of the real points is that the Dow Jones Industrial Average had enjoyed a 5-year bull run. And so we had moved from 772 points in 1982 to an incredible 2,722 in 1987. So the moment was ripe for a huge price for a masterpiece. It was also the height of the Japanese economic bubble. Why was Japan relevant? Because the picture sold to Japanese. It sold to the Yasuda Fire and Marine Insurance Company, and it was the first time that we'd seen an Asian bidder walk into an international showroom in New York or in London and buy such a major picture. And they went at it fiercely. I think they probably would have gone on even further. And the interesting thing about auction is not who the buyer is, but how far they might have gone. I wonder how much more they might have paid for this. I wonder how much more might have been paid for the Salvator Mundi. When I've broken records, and broken a lot of them in my career, it's always the question that's left in my mind. And you only really discover until you sell the next example by the same artist. So there we have it. The Yasuda Fire and Marine Insurance Company buys this object. Just about the painting, when Van Gogh was painting these Saint-Remy and Arles sunflowers pictures, he was at his happiest, incredibly. You see his late paintings. I'm sure that many of you saw the show at the National Gallery, which was an inspiration to put on. You saw the happiness that actually is in Van Gogh's work. We all consider him to be the great melancholic, the man who committed suicide, who sort of failed to kill himself but died from his gunshot wound. But actually there is such happiness, such beauty in his pictures of the last 2 years. And the National Gallery celebrated their 250th year with a picture which effectively, a sunflower picture which had been bought by the Courtauld, was the painting that actually triggered the decision to have that show. That had been bought 100 years before by Sam Courtauld, and it was the reason that the National Gallery decided to devote that major exhibition to Van Gogh. Interestingly, I've been asked many times, how often do museum shows help the art market? They are quintessential to the art market. So on that note, watch out for Hockney prices in the next few years. Those of you that haven't been, one of the great, great shows is taking place, unfortunately not in England, but in Paris. And that's the Hockney exhibition, which you must go and see. Curated by Norman Rosenthal, the greatest of the British curators of the last 50 years, with all his work at the Royal Academy, and it really is an outstanding show. Over 400 paintings. Difficult to get tickets. Call me if you want one. So money in the market. Before we go on to the next slide, just a quick point about that. The richest man in the world in 1987 was from which country? Anybody want to hazard a guess from the audience? US. The US. Thank you for the shot. Incorrect. Greece. Incorrect. Brunei is interesting. It could have been Brunei, but we don't quite know because the royal wealth wasn't recorded at the time. The richest man in the world was recorded in 1987 as being Yoshiaki Tsutsumi of the Seibu Corporation of Japan. And actually, 23 of the dollar billionaires in 1987 were Japanese. And extraordinarily, there were only 140 dollar billionaires in 1987. So a huge proportion of them were from Japan. And we should have seen it coming, which is why now China will come and they will buy some of the greatest works. The Middle Eastern collectors, they will come and they will buy some of the greatest works. In a sense, the art world is relatively predictable. Those people that have the greatest wealth are most likely to buy these masterpieces. Fortunately today, many are very philanthropic and they ensure that they go into the great museums to be shown. So sometimes when these pictures come out, they haven't been seen for 50 or 60 years, suddenly they come out, they're sold to very wealthy individuals who then put them on loan. And I'll mention that as we run through some pictures in the coming slides. This, for example, is on show in Tokyo. Anybody that visits Japan can go and see this in the Seibu Museum there. So Van Gogh in 1987, followed by the next great moment. So this is Charlie Hindlip selling the picture at Christie's. The next great moment was Picasso, of course, the Mozart of the 20th century, as I've often said, in terms of painting. This is a self-portrait of himself, which is just called Yo Picasso, I or me, Picasso. He painted this at the age of 20 years of age, when he was invited by Vollard to have a show just of his work. He actually shared it with a fellow Spaniard, and he had basically 6 months in which to paint the works that he was going to exhibit. And painting number 1 was this picture. And he painted it and called it Yo Picasso. He dropped his name Ruiz, which is the family name, his father's name. And when his father or his uncle asked him, in fact, why he dropped the name, he said, Matisse only has one name, Raphael only had one name, Picasso too will only have one name. So he predicted at the age of 20 that he was going to be the genius that we all now know he became. This picture was sold for $47 million. The buyer was a private European. And in a way, 1989 was the moment when we all believed the art market had reached its highest ever level. We found that these prices were impossible to replicate. And actually what happened was that the following year, this picture came up. The Dr. Gachet. Dr. Gachet, an 1890s picture. Pissarro had recommended Van Gogh to go and stay in Dr. Gachet's retreat. Dr. Gachet was going to look after him, look after his psychiatric well-being. And in a letter to Theo, Van Gogh, just listen to how sane he was, wrote this: "I think we must not count on Dr. Gachet at all," he said. "First of all, he is sicker than I am." Now, when one blind man leads another blind man, don't they both fall into a ditch? Fascinating. So 6 weeks after his portrait, he committed suicide. But it is, when you see this picture, incredibly engaging. And there's an inevitability about these masterpieces when you see them, that they will attract the type of competition that reflects your own interest in the object. It's very simple. People often ask me, how do you value pictures? And I say you have to look. You have to use your eyes. Obviously, you have to know the history of the pictures, where they've been to some degree, how rare they might be, obviously is important, but it's the picture itself that speaks 1,000 words, particularly to those people that bid for them. The history of this object was it was confiscated by Goering as an example of degenerate art in 1937. It had been in the Städel, the Frankfurt Museum, from 1911. Interestingly, the majority of great Van Goghs were bought by German collectors in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Something I did do a count at one stage. It was like 65% of the pictures that I considered to be important were bought by Germans. This picture was bought by the Städel for the museum. It was then returned to the owners, the Kramarski family, who then sold it. And again, it sold to a Japanese buyer. Then the bubble, economic bubble, burst in 1990, and it took a while for the market to come back. So here we have Christopher Burge selling the painting. He was my predecessor as the principal auctioneer at Christie's, with Michael Finley behind him, who still works in the art market for Aquavella in New York. Writes a lot about the art market and is a very, very good writer. For those of you that want to research more into what's gone in the open market over the past few years, read Michael Finley's texts. So here you have Dr. Gachet presented in the podium. As you see, the auctioneer in those days wore black tie. I put paid to that. I didn't agree with that. So I felt it was a little bit pompous, so we dropped it. 1997, and this happens. We're back to Picasso. So this was the moment really that my talk should begin, but I think we needed that sort of run into this to understand a little bit about what was going on. The Gance sale was extraordinary. There were only 5 artists that were shown in it. Rauschenberg, Franz Steller, Jasper Johns, Eva Hesse. By no means household names to the Europeans, but you had Picasso, and you had Picasso in droves. Have a look at their sitting room. The television is where you are. Seriously, the television is where you are, and the entrance is here. So you walk into this snug. You've got 4 femmes d'Alger, and there's a 5th here to my right, and you've got the Buste de Femme d'Apres Cranach lithograph there, or lino cut rather, hanging by the door, behind the door. So when the door's open, you don't see that. But this was a most extraordinary apartment. I remember visiting it and helping to do the valuation of these pictures. And it's this picture which I'm going to come back to later on in this talk. This is the Femme d'Alger, painted by Picasso at the death of Matisse. He went to the Louvre to look at Delacroix, and he used this subject to effectively out-Matisse, which is something that he did throughout his career. Picasso would pick up another artist's work, his thread, and by interpreting that artist's work, often destroy him. So George Braque, for example, great artist, father of Cubism with Picasso, never really was able to recover from the fact that when Picasso started to adapt his work, he did it so much better. Actually, it's something that happened in Old Master studios often. The master, old master painter, when he discovered that his pupil was better than he was, he'd step back and let his pupil do the major work and step away from being the front man, if you like, of the studios, particularly in Italy. Martin could probably take us through another discussion about that in the future. This sale was the moment, if you just go back to the Rev, if you don't mind, Chester. This sale was a sale which signified the moment when a collection could start to have an impact on competition in the room. The New York Times wrote, "This was a sale everyone wanted to attend. Collectors who rarely go to auctions showed up last night." This is the morning after. "Not necessarily bidding for themselves, but just to be there. Leonard Lauder, the cosmetics magnate, Mort Zuckerman, the publisher and developer, and William H. Gates, whose son Bill is the chairman of Microsoft." That was before we knew what impact he'd have on the world. But his dad was an art collector. And when there was one lot that didn't sell by Robert Rauschenberg at the end of the sale, it was the first time I've ever witnessed it, but 500 collectors booed. They didn't boo the auctioneer, they booed each other for not celebrating this great collection. But the Gance collection made $206 million, less than half what the Salvator Mundi fetched, or was to fetch later, but nevertheless the greatest single-owner collection in the history of the art market. And La Rêve, this wonderful painting of Marie-Thérèse Walter, his muse, whom he met at the age of 50, she was 17. This was a picture that symbolised a movement in towards modernism. I think within 5 years or 6 years, 7 out of the top 10 works of art sold were by Picasso were of this particular subject of Marie-Thérèse. She became, if you like, the hero image of the art market, again driven by one great price. Similarly, at the moment, you see the Magritte prices. If those of you that follow the art market, you'll see that René Magritte prices are very high. It's a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. The minute that one great painting comes up and makes a big price, people that own others come to the market with them, as the team from Malams will certainly testify to, and therefore prices for that artist tend to rise and remain very consistent for a long time. Of all of them, Picasso and probably Monet have been the most consistent, and we'll look at that a bit later as well. Next image. So, what happened next? We discovered masterpieces. Collections were one thing, but when we'd seen these very high prices at Christie's in 2013-14, we had a meeting of all the senior specialists and we discussed how we could have an influence on the art market. And it was quite obvious that the best way to do it was to find great works of art. But we started to try to curate sales and put together many works of art in one auction that were of the highest caliber. And you'll see a whole series of them now. This is a Bacon triptych, which is fascinating. This was sold by us in 2013. This was the beginnings of this new way of working. We were less interested in the size of the sales and the quality of the objects that we found. This picture is of 3 panels, obviously, painted by Bacon at the height of his career of his great friend Lucien Freud. It was painted 3 years before Bacon's Grand Palais show in 1972, which really made Bacon the artist that we all know today, because it was the height of his fame. It was also the moment that George Dyer committed suicide, so there was some drama around it, some tragedy for Bacon, but nevertheless it really did launch his career in the States. When this came up for sale, I flew to America to take the auction, and it was really one of the most exciting moments in my career. People often ask me, was it the Salvator Mundi? I said there were so many. But flying to America, knowing that I would be selling a Bacon triptych that would challenge the world record, I hoped it would make more than 100 million. Nothing had sold for more than 100 million Hammer before. I also hoped that it would be for a British artist, Bacon, and I knew Lucien Freud, and I hoped that it would be for an image of somebody that I've always admired and is one of the great artists of Britain. And it all came together. There was a huge amount of bidding, 7 bidders. It was the longest bidding session I'd ever had, 10 minutes of bidding, and proper bidding. The price was estimated, I think, in the region of $40 to $60 million, and I hammered it down for 142 million. So we didn't just break 100 million, we really achieved a target for everybody to chase. And that's what then I'll explain as we move through the images, what happened over the subsequent few years. Just on Bacon, a couple of thoughts. First of all, he wrote, "All painting is an accident, but it's also not an accident, because one must select what part of the accident one chooses to preserve." A fascinating view of how we should choose our subjects for those of you that are painters. The other thing that I think is an interesting point to raise is that he wrote, "Picasso is the reason why I paint. He is the father figure who gave me the wish to paint." So the market, which has followed Picasso over the last 20 years and has paid a lot of money for his greatest pictures, is in fact sort of following the tastes of some of the arbiters of what great is. And I think Bacon, certainly for those of you that have seen any of his major exhibitions or enjoy his art, would certainly agree with me. He's the genius of British painting. Freud was great, but I think Bacon potentially is the genius. Back to here it is in the sale room. You can see the numbers. I think that's the moment when I hammered it down. So $127 million with premium is over 140, but you can see the sale room. Everybody was there. Wonderful night. If you go to the next slide, just. So then we come back to Gance. Why do we come back to Gance? Because this picture, we went after it again, knowing that it had done so well before when it came up, the Femme d'Alger 0 as it is, or O. In 1956, the Gance family bought the whole series for $212,000. In 1989, they sold this picture for 31. In 2015, I sold it for 180. It's an interesting one for me because in a way it signified a moment where we had to look at which artists we really believed in as being the masters in the canon. And we came up with the following. We came up with Matisse, Modigliani, Klimt, Monet, Van Gogh, of course, plus Picasso. So we went after major works by Picasso. To that we added the next generation, Bacon, Freud, de Kooning, Twombly, Rothko. And then we were told that we should also look after the markets for Basquiat, Dubuffet and Doig, interestingly. Doig, the Scottish artist, great painter, one of my favourite artists. And so we tried to garner paintings by each of those artists that would tell a certain story for each of these sales. So it was May 2014, November 2014, and then May 2015, where we saw sales on one night that were worth $700, $800 million. A sort of cascade of wonderful things. If we go to the next. The Pointing Man, this arguably Giacometti's greatest sculpture, hand-painted, standing 6 foot high, executed in one night. He was struggling with the subject, and he quite simply dedicated a whole night between midnight and the morning to finish this object so it could be taken to a show in America, which was being held by one of the great dealers who insisted that this piece should be included. He hand-painted it, had it ready, and it was collected first thing in the morning. It went to a collector in America called Sheldon Solo, and Sheldon, when he knew what we were planning, contacted me, and I went to see him, and he said, "Which of my Giacomettis do you think we should be selling?" And I said, "Well, it's really not my choice, but as an auctioneer, this would be the one, the Pointing Man." Could almost be me in the rostrum. And he went ahead with it, and the sculpture sold for, I must remind myself, $142 million on the night. It's still the world record for any sculpture. It was executed in 1947, just after the war, when Europe and the rest of the world were looking for direction. I still think that this picture is also about, this object rather is about Giacometti saying, "Follow me, this is the way." There's a sort of certainty about the sculpture. Can we just go back to the full image of it just for 1 second? There's a nobility, an incredible balance. Marvellous thing. We then went to, in the audience that night, there was somebody who didn't introduce themselves to me, who I got to know very, very well later, who came to see what the market was like because they had made the decision that they would sell a very, very major work in May, if I felt the time was right. I had no idea what I was going to see, but I flew out to a storage facility in Europe, and she and I looked at a picture which she hadn't seen for 40 years, which had been given to her by her parents, and it was this picture. It's being held here by staff from Christie's with white gloves, but when it came out of the crate, it was sort of hauled out by the art handlers in the warehouse. And in spite of the fact there was no lighting, no proper lighting, I knew immediately that we were dealing with Modigliani's greatest work. This is his new couché of 1917, 33 years of age, dies shortly afterwards. At the height of his talents, it has an amazing surface, great balance. The way that she's bursting out of the frame of the painting is incredibly modern, and there's a nobility in the composition, and she's completely in control of the situation here. When this hangs in a space, it's impossible for her not to dominate that area. It's a very difficult picture to hang with other paintings because it's so strong. A remarkable painting. And talking about buyers, the previous triptych had been bought by Elaine Wynne and is in Los Angeles, the Freud. This picture, bought by a Chinese buyer. It was bought by Liu Chen of the Long Museum, where one can view it. A collector who has bought very many great things in the Chinese market, but who has very sophisticated westernized taste as well, and has a huge cultural curiosity, and has bought, along with his wife, very many great 21st century works, such as Jenny Saville, Peter Doig, and so forth. But amongst his greatest objects are obviously this Modigliani. But the Chinese, the Taiwanese, the Indonesians, and the Chinese based in Hong Kong are incredibly interested in buying works of art in every field, but particularly at the top of the Western art market. And that will continue. 2016, so the year after this, there's the sale room. The year after, just pause for a moment. Could you go back one? Yeah. So the year after this was a year of consolidation in 2016. The market dropped $7 billion from 60 million to 56 million, or 62 million to 56 million. And we were concerned about it. But actually what was happening was that the buyers that had been looking at Modigliani, Van Gogh, Cézanne, Monet, they started to look at wet paint. They started to look at the younger generation of artists, the contemporary artists. And we moved into a new era, which we've seen for the last 10 years, which is that contemporary painters started to make huge sums, as some of the collectors that have chased these masterpieces by those artists already in the canon, and they were effectively predicting which of the younger artists that were working today were going to also be included in that canon. So we saw Hockney selling at $11.7 million, a world record for Hockney. Adrian Gany selling for $9 million, a record for Gany. Nadeka Crosby selling for over $1 million for a picture that had only been painted a couple of years before. John Currin, Nice and Easy at $12 million. Suddenly the contemporary artists started to come through. I think maybe it's because the collectors buying these great classic modern works didn't see enough variety. And maybe they wanted some works of art that spoke to them about their generation. And that's certainly what we've seen over the last few years. What happened, though, in this pause was that we had time to think about other things, and we went looking for other major works of art. This Leonardo da Vinci, the Salvator Mundi, became the most celebrated painting that probably has been sold in the past 50 years, for all sorts of reasons. It had belonged to 3 kings of England, it had gone missing, it had been restored, and in the restoration, extraordinary discoveries were made about pentimenti, so on and so forth. And the story itself does read like a thriller. But I was very privileged to be involved in the whole process, the expertise side, where Martin Kemp, who's with us obviously tonight, played his part as well, but all the Leonardo experts coming together, and following their scholarship, and then also being very intimately involved in the restoration and seeing what came of the work that was discovered from the x-rays and so on and so forth. And then having that one moment in New York on the night of November the 15th, when we weren't quite sure what would happen. I opened the bidding at $120 million. And the bids went in 10s to begin with, then it went in 20s, and the final bid was $30 million, which was the equivalent, if you like, of the sunflowers, so 30 million. If you think back to the 25 million, it was only a little bit less. One bid of 30 million. The increment was 30 million. It was an incredibly exciting moment, very, very memorable for all that were there. It's one of those situations where everybody said, in the art market, says, yes, I was there. That room must have been 50,000 people deep. But I was certainly there. And probably it'll be the single most exciting moment that I've been involved in as an auctioneer. The greatest picture I've sold some good ones. What followed then? Immediately after that, we went back to the great sales. There it is. I'm looking at it in London, showing it to a client. We go to the next. Rockefeller, Nelson Rockefeller. Why I highlight this is that there was a Great move towards philanthropy, and Rockefeller was really responsible for it in so many ways. The whole of the collection, which made over $860 million, all of the proceeds from it went to great causes, mainly medical and higher education, some support of the arts, sustainable economic development. I remember David was very interested in as well. So great pillars that really he led by example, and you'll see there were others that then followed. It was touted as the sale of the century. This is in 2018. It led to one of the highest totals for the art market altogether that year in 2018, which is 68 billion, part of which obviously is this particular sale. This painting was bought by another Asian collector, interestingly, so just talking about the influence of Chinese and Asian collectors in general. This was bought by an Asian. It made over $82 million, a great nymphaeus. This hung on the stairs of David Rockefeller's home, which was a beautiful mansion. As you walk down the stairwell, this picture was on the turn of the stairs, so you literally felt as though you were walking in to this nymphaeus painting, which was remarkable. And here it is, 75 million as the final bid. Nick Finch here, who's still the main sales clerk at Christie's, who's witnessed all of these sales and more over the years. Another person that, if you have the chance to meet, he's incredibly interesting about what's happened in the market over those years. Always there by my side. So we thought that this was going to be the moment when the ultimate philanthropic gift would be made, over $850 million. But in fact, of course, there's one greater than that. Paul Allen. Paul Allen's collection, which was one of the last collections that I sold at Christie's, which made $1.6 billion. And all of those proceeds have gone to great causes. Just talking about contemporary art for a moment, if I can switch. The next great moment for me was here, this picture. Talking about Hockney, this picture's on view in Paris. Do please go and see it. Do go and please see the show. This is a picture of Peter Schlesinger, who had been Hockney's partner in the 70s. In 1971, they split up, and he was working on this painting. So, because they split up, he abandoned it. He came back to it in 1972 and painted his masterpiece. And this is a picture that belonged to somebody I knew extremely well. I had known throughout my career at Christie's. In fact, he bought, I think, his first modern picture from me. And I went to him, would you put the Hockney on the market now? And after some discussion about what it was worth, he said to me, do you think it's worth 80 million? I said, it could be worth 80 million, which was a huge number for a living artist. And I did say from the rostrum, I gather under my breath, we got there. And often people thought that was something about the reserve or some finance deal. And actually, it's good I'd made a promise that would make 80 million. And the last bid, extraordinarily, was $80 million. And it then was the world record for any living artist's work. And I thought that this record would last for a long time. It lasted for 6 months. This happened. So those of you that went to the Ashmolean show on the top floor, the Koons exhibition, this is one of Jeff Koons' masterpieces. It's a sort of icon, a holy grail of his work. It belonged to Cy Newhouse, the great publisher. And it's actually from edition of 3. A lot of people didn't realise that, or don't seem to have forgotten it, but this is a multiple. This isn't unique. And this made $91 million. Actually, the hammer price was exactly the same as the Hockney, but because Christie's put up their commission rates by a fraction, it became the most expensive. So I always correct people. I say, actually, it's only the same price as our great David Hockney. I haven't dared say that to Jeff Koons yet, but the moment will come. But a word about wet paint and about contemporary art. For those of you that are very interested in contemporary art, here's the warning. I'm going to leave the bunny rabbit up there. And describe to in 2019, there were 10 artists who represented the most expensive contemporary artists, 10 of them. And I'll read you their names because that's a good list. Jeff Koons was top with the rabbit. Hockney was second with the pools. Christopher Wool, Peter Doig, Nara, Zheng Fangji, Chen Yifei, both Chinese artists, interestingly. Kerry James Marshall, Catalan and Grotchan. Only one of them has broken their record since 2019. That is because the contemporary market has slowed down. People aren't quite as confident as they were before, in my opinion. Others would argue that it's just because the masterpieces haven't come up. There's only one of them, and that's, let me remind myself. Yes, Peter Doig. I sold his Swamped Canoe for effectively $40 million. He's the only artist that, of those 10 contemporary painters who have beaten their records set before 2019. So there's a lot more caution in the contemporary market than there was a few years ago. And last but not least, before we go to questions, I wanted to show you one of the icons. I was born in '63. Warhol painted Marilyn in '64. He did 5 of these. Talking about damaged pictures, this picture had a hole in it because it had been shot. In 1964, just before he released the series of 5, he invited what he called a press photographer, or believed was a press photographer, Dorothy Podmer, to his studio. And she said, "I've come to shoot your Marilyns." And she pulled from her handbag a small silver gun, and she shot them. She shot them just above the eyebrow here. One of them, for whatever reason, wasn't in the stack, but the other 4 were. So this is called the Shot Sage Blue Marilyn. And it is the most expensive work by a 20th century artist. It is more expensive than Picasso. It made just short of $200 million. It belonged to a lady called Doris Amann, who was a fantastic person. She gave all the money to medical research. Good for her. So I know a lot is said about people in the art market spending a lot of money on works of art. A lot of them are extremely philanthropic. In fact, I think probably 4 or 5 of the things that we've looked at tonight, all the money has gone to charity. But this one, for me, was the ultimate. I'd hoped it would make over 200 million, but it didn't. But it is the last of the great things that I sold as an auctioneer at Christie's. And now my role is to buy things for people. So the boot is on the other foot. I now go after these things, whether privately or in the auction rooms, to buy them for some of the top collectors that worked with me when I was the auctioneer. And it's a lot of fun, I can tell you that much. But it's also great to be here and to have the chance to introduce some of these works to you. And